part of the American mindset, part of the American dream. It's built into this word right here, autonomy. Autonomy. In fact, our nation is built on the concept, the Declaration of, anybody know? Independence, yeah. I mean, what's more than autonomy than the Declaration of Independence, which means nobody is the boss of me, right? I get to be my own boss. And it's so baked into our history as a country. It's so baked into who we are. It's what has allowed us to have American innovation, ingenuity. It's not a bad thing. I mean, it allowed us to settle the Wild West. It has brought us to the point where the United States has 2 coronavirus vaccines, and the other countries, as far as I'm aware, have 0 coronavirus vaccines. And so, I mean, autonomy is a good thing. It has led us to some great places, but what we're talking about through this series right in the eye is that it can actually have some pitfalls along with it. Because part of the American dream is I want to do what I want to do, when I want, with whom I want. We talked about this last week, and then we added a little caveat. Do you remember what it was? It's as long as anybody doesn't hurt, as long as it doesn't hurt anybody. As long as nobody's hurt in the process, I can do what I want, when I want, with whom I want, as long as nobody gets hurt. But the thing we talked about last week, and this is really important in case you weren't with us, and we're just going to do kind of a quick catch-up. The thing we talked about last week is that this is a lie because someone is always hurt. If no one other than yourself. You hurt yourself. The irony with autonomy is that autonomy actually hurts us. In trying to set ourselves free, so often we build a prison around ourselves that we can't get out of. But you know who else gets hurt? The people who are with you. In fact, in the book of Proverbs, there's a verse that says, the companion of fools suffers harm. And it's just kind of true that even though you didn't make the bad decision, somebody you were with made a bad decision and you ended up suffering as a result. The people who love you end up suffering. The people you love end up suffering. Even the people who come after you. And we talked last week about how it's just kind of true. Some of us, as we look at the dysfunction in our families, as we look at the things that we've gone through in childhood, the thing we would point back to is a group of people, or a person in particular, from a prior generation who chose autonomy. Who said, I want to do what I want to do, when I want to do, when I want to do it, with whom I want to do it, and I don't really care what you have to say or think or do because it doesn't affect you. It's my deal. But the problem was it did affect you, or it affected your sibling, your brother, your sister. It affected somebody else. It always impacts somebody else. Someone is always hurt. And the truth is, our expressions of autonomy, I mean, they change. They're in different ways. If you're a teenager, you're tired of your parents telling you who you can hang out with and where you're allowed to go and what you want to do. And so, when they're not around, you can maybe party a little bit on the weekends or drink a little, smoke a little, sleep around a little. I mean, whatever it is. Or you get into your 20s or your college years, freshman year of college, the mouse is away, the cat's away, the mouse will play, and maybe you played so much you had to go somewhere else your second year. I don't know. I mean, and then you get older to your 30s, your 40s, maybe your 50s, and you hit that midlife time, and you're just kind of tired. You're tired of driving a minivan that smells like Cheerios. You're tired of, having to come home and do whatever everybody else wants to do. You're tired of being married. You're tired of, the kids hanging off of you. And so, you do kind of what it looked like in your teenage years, except now you weigh a little bit more, you have a little less hair, and you have a lot more money to do a lot more damage. We'll just say that, right? I mean, so it's just kind of interesting, and it plays itself out in different times and different seasons of life. But here's what's fascinating about this. The desire to do what I want, when I want, with whom I want, it's nothing new. You thought it was just you, but I'm telling you, it has been around for centuries. In fact, baked into the history of the nation of Israel, which is what we're studying during this series right in the eye. I mean, this group of people, and the Old Testament is really the story, the history of the people of Israel. It's the Jewish scriptures. Baked within there is this kind of propensity toward doing what I want to do. And what's interesting is it started out with a man, Abraham, and Abraham was unique in that he trusted God as no one else, as far as we can tell. I mean, he up and moved. He trusted God in such a unique way, and Abraham had a son who had a couple sons, and over time it turned into a nation of people. And these people were known for trusting God. Their faith is what made them unique. And they had these 12 tribes. In fact, during the season they were talking about, there was a commonwealth of 12 tribes. They were set up not as a king with a kingdom. They were set up as a theocracy. And that God was the king. God was the king. God was the one who laid out the laws. God had given the law through Moses, and God is the one who ended up raising up people like the judges. There were men and women who were raised up to help lead the people. But the point of a theocracy is it's God's laws, it's God's rules and we choose whether or not we're going to follow them. And even as he raised up leaders, Moses and Joshua and others who would lead the people, the truth is, even though they were God's chosen people, they struggled with autonomy too. They didn't like being told what to do, just like you and I don't like being told what to do. Now, this period of Judges, it began with Joshua in roughly 1380 BC, and it kind of ended with King David or King Saul, right around 1050 BC. And so the period of Judges is about 300 years in Israel's history. 300 years during which there were this commonwealth of 12 tribes. God was their king. There wasn't no human king, but God was their king, and they would make the decision of whether or not they would submit to them. And throughout this story, we realize that there's kind of this repeating history. And it's a repeating history so many of us can recognize and we can see in our own lives. It goes like this, that they would disobey God because they didn't like his rules. At some point in time, you've disobeyed rules you didn't like. It resulted in disaster because turning away from God always results in disaster. And then they would find themselves realizing that they had chosen autonomy, they had chosen to do their own thing, but it didn't result in what they wanted. They found themselves in a prison of their own making. And then as a result, they would cry out to him. And it would lead to deliverance until they got to the point where they disobeyed again and went back to disaster, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, last week we looked at a very unique story. And if you weren't here, I just got to tell you, you should go online to our website and check it out. It's kind of like makes Silence of the Lambs look like a Disney film, if I can be blunt. I mean, it's just crazy story. And it's the ending of the book of Judges. And so, and after the end of that story, it all ended with this statement in Judges chapter 21. It says, "In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. No one's going to tell me what to do. I'm going to do what I want, when I want, with whom I want." And it was disaster because there was no moral consensus. There was no moral compass. There was nothing moving people in the right direction. They all just did whatever they thought was right. And what's so interesting about the story of Israel is it ended in absolute tragedy, as we looked at last week. But it began kind of like the last night of church camp. The last night of church camp? Anybody been to church camp? Any church campers in here? Man, I love church camp. I think church camp is a fantastic thing. If you have kids, when they're teenagers, you should send them to church camp. I am not making fun of church camp in this whole conversation, just so you know. I believe in it. I think it's wonderful. Some of your lives were changed at church camp, and that is a fantastic, as I said, it's just great. But what I'm about to say, if you're kind of on the edge of Christianity or you think Christians are already a little bit weird, what I'm going to say is only going to further that narrative for you. Because there's something that happens the last night of church camp. Anybody know what it is? Cry night. It's cry night, the last night of church camp. Yeah, I mean, sometimes there's a fire, you throw your stick in the fire, but here's what happened. Kids are together for a week, they're teenagers, their hormones are raging. I mean, they're already a little bit strange as it is. They found a boyfriend or a girlfriend for a week, they probably made out somewhere they weren't supposed to and then broke up. And then they haven't had a decent shower, they haven't had much sleep. I mean, they're just getting worn down. And there are these emotional messages, and the adults are telling them things like you need to quit hanging out with those friends because they're not good for you, or break up with your girlfriend because she's, taking you in the wrong direction, or, quit looking at porn, it's an addiction, or you need to restore things with your parents, and you need to get things right with your parents. And so at the end of this week, it's like this culmination of emotion. And then they throw a campfire there. Or for me, when I was a youth pastor, I took them to the beach, and I would do a beach walk on the last night. It's like the captives have been worn down, right? And you take them on this beach walk at night. The stars are out. They hear the waves crashing. I'll never forget one of these beach walk nights. They're supposed to be silent so they can hear God speak to them. Because, God's always speaking. It's just a matter of whether or not we're listening. And so, you tune out the noise and you can actually, hear God. And so we would do this long beach walk, and at the end we'd circle up and kids would share what God had been speaking to them during this time. I'll never forget one in particular one. There was this kind of punk kid. I really liked him. Actually, not really punk, but he was kind of full of himself, and, he knew everything. And he just started to cry and cry and cry. I mean, I wish I had invested in Kleenex before this, because everybody then, he breaks down, everybody breaks down. I mean, it's just this big cry fest. And you decide in those moments to quit everything. You're going to be done with it all. You're going to move forward. You're going to go back home, and life is going to be so different because you're flying high as a kite, and Jesus this, and we love Jesus. Yes, we do. We love Jesus. How about you? And then you get home. And your parents, you're going to sleep in. I mean, come on, you got chores to do, or your friends are calling you up, and you're like, well, I made this promise at camp, but, I don't have anything to do the rest of the summer. I don't want to be by myself. I mean, and it wasn't that you didn't mean it. It wasn't that your commitment was worthless to you in the moment. It's just that it didn't last very long. And the same is kind of true with the nation of Israel, because it ended like one of those campfire experiences or beach walk experiences. In fact, the book of Joshua leads us into the book of Judges, and the book of Judges is, or Joshua is when Joshua kind of goes off and dies, and he passes the people on into the promised land. And here's what Joshua tells the people at the end of the book of Joshua. He says, "Now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshiped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve the Lord," which is kind of like his rendition of throw out the cigarettes and the porn and, break up and make things right with your parents. This is what you need to do, guys. And if you don't want to, now this is key. If you don't want to, you need to know God's not going to force you. In fact, here's what he goes on to say. He says, "But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves." Now, this is kind of interesting because God doesn't force people into a relationship with him. God says, I want you to choose for yourself. Choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve. But Joshua said, as for me and my household, this is where we're going. We will serve the Lord. And then the people responded. The people said this. They said, "Far be it from us to forsake the Lord and to serve other gods." They said, "Joshua, we hear what you're saying. We want that. That's what we want. That's what we need. We want to change our ways. We want things to be different after we get on the bus and go home. We want to serve the Lord." And so the text continues. It says, "It was the Lord our God himself who brought us and our parents up out of Egypt from that land of slavery and performed these great signs before our eyes." Joshua, we don't want to go back there. We've heard the stories. We know what our parents and grandparents endured. We don't want that. We want to be different. Egypt, bad. Promised land, good. I mean, this is what we want. They said, we too will serve the Lord because he is our God. We don't want another king. We want God. And then at this point, Joshua kind of taunts them a little bit. And Joshua says, yeah, I've heard that before. Everybody rededicates his life at camp, right? I mean, that's just what happens. You just rededicate your life. But then you get on the bus and you go home and things are never the same. I mean, and before long, you're going to forget about what slave life was like. You're going to forget about those stories your ancestors told you, your grandparents and parents, all those good things. The people, they disagreed with Joshua. The text says, but the people said to Joshua, no, we will serve the Lord. So they loaded up the buses. They went home. They committed that they were going to be different. Everything was going to be different. They were going to quit everything. And they did. And things were different for a little bit. But then they did what you and I, if you've had that camp experience before, you know what happens. You get back to life. And you start compromising. And you start looking around and seeing what other people are doing, and you kind of like what they have, and you think, I'd kind of like that too. I like that you get to go out on Friday night. I'd like to go out on Friday night. I don't want to be alone the rest of my life. I mean, we just see what other people want, and then we start comparing, and we start thinking about it, and we want it. And the Israelites, it's kind of interesting because it really wasn't long after Joshua died. It's almost like they just kind of finished burying him in the ground. They moved into the promised land, and they were to get rid of all the people in the promised land. They were supposed to push them all out, and they started doing that at first. But over time, I think they began thinking about, we know what it was like to be slaves, but I wonder what it's like to have slaves. And we've got all these people here, and you know what? We could enslave these people, and then we'd know what it's like to have slaves, and then we wouldn't have to do the labor on our own. And so that's what they did. They moved into the promised land. Rather than getting rid of the people they were told to get rid of, they enslaved the people. And here, in a strange turn of irony, they became enslaved by those same people. It's interesting. Just a short time later, Judges chapter 2 says, "Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and they served the Baals." I mean, again, this just wasn't even long after their commitment. Got home from camp, friend called him up. "What you doing? It's Friday night. You want to come party?" "I'm not doing anything. What happens at camp stays at camp." And they broke all their commitments. The text says they forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshiped various gods of the peoples around them. Again, they started looking around. They started being jealous of what other people had and saying, "I want that. I think that'd be good for me. Let me have a little bit of that." Joshua had warned them. They had promised, but they continued down that path. The text says they aroused the Lord's anger because they forsook him and served Baal and the Ashtoreths. Now, here's what's kind of interesting, because Baal was the god of fertility, and the Ashtoreths were like the female counterpart of that god of fertility. And so, they're living in an agrarian culture where they're growing crops, they're helping animals reproduce, they're farmers and they're tending flocks and whatever else. And so, as a result of that, the idea of a god of fertility, that sounds kind of nice, because when you have a bad crop season, you need help getting stuff to grow. And so a god of fertility would be a perfect god to add to our list. Now, this was problematic on a couple of levels. One, because God had told them, "You can have no other kings other than me, no other gods before me." But then secondly, that when crops start to fail and you need to get the God's attention, do you know what you do to get God's attention? You make a sacrifice. And in order to make a sacrifice to Baal, people had to sacrifice people. And over time, it wasn't just adult people. It was children people. And as a parent, I can't even imagine what that was like. And frankly, as 21st century Americans, it's kind of hard to imagine what that's like to actually put a human being on an altar and light that person on fire. But here's the thing that I know, because it's true of me, I'm sure it's true of you, is that when we pursue what other people have, we end up sacrificing things we never meant to sacrifice in order to worship a God we never wanted to serve in the first place. I mean, isn't it true you've sacrificed relationships for a job and for hours at work? Or you've sacrificed relationships for a political point of view? Or maybe you've sacrificed influence on your children for your work or for another relationship. I mean, it's just so fascinating. And before we realize it, we have sacrificed the thing that was so important to us for a God that we didn't even want in the first place. Now again, I mean, Joshua tried to warn the Israelites. God warned the Israelites. And so as a result, it's kind of like he put them in timeout. Verse 14 says this: "In his anger against Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist." Now that sounds a little bit harsh, but just track with me. It says they were in great distress. I mean, God basically looked at the nation of Israel and said, if you want what they have, you can have it. If you want what they've got, go ahead. If you want to copy them, you go ahead and copy them. But what you're going to discover is you're going to be conquered by the kingdom you're trying to copy. And they didn't realize it at the time, but in their efforts toward autonomy, they ended up building a prison around themselves, and they were trapped inside. They started out as conquerors moving into this promised land, but they ended up conquered. They forsook the Lord. They ignored his ways. They wanted what everybody else wanted. They followed the people around them. They began, longing after what everyone else had and desiring what everyone else had. So in the end, they surrendered their freedom. And I'm telling you, within this text, there is kind of a baked-in lesson for us, and it's within these words right here. They were no longer able to resist. They couldn't stop They couldn't stop. They did what they wanted, when they wanted, with whom they wanted, but it was a trap. It was a trap that they could no longer control. Their expression of freedom became a prison, and the lesson is simply this, that Israel traded one king for another. They did. And again, we can all relate to that. We can all relate to that. Whether you're a Christian and you grew up learning about Jesus and the Ten Commandments and you should do this and you obeyed your parents and you said yes to your parents over and over and over again and you just got to the point where you said, I want to say yes to me for once. And I want to quit doing what God wants me to do. I just want to prioritize me for once. Or if you didn't grow up as a Christian, but you grew up in a household that had morals and values, and you did, you were a good little boy or girl until you got to middle school or high school, and you said, I'm tired of doing what everyone else wants me to do, and so I'm just going to say yes to me, and I'm going to prioritize what it is that I want. But then you woke up realizing that your expression of freedom didn't actually set you free. You know why that is? Do you know why you just trade one king for another? It's because you're a created being. We're all created beings. I know that could be a little bit offensive depending on where you are in your faith journey. But to say you're a created being means that there's a creator. And if there's a creator, then that means that you were created with the idea of being in submission to someone or something. You were created to have a king in your life. You were not created to survive with complete autonomy. In fact, complete autonomy won't even get you what you want in life. C.S. Lewis, the great Christian author, he wrote a fascinating book called The Great Divorce. And it's not about divorce at all. It's actually about hell. And none of us on earth knows exactly what hell's like, but C.S. Lewis took his best stab at trying to describe what hell would be like. And in his book, he talks about how people just imagine something into being. That's hell, that people imagine it into being and they have it. And as a result, no one likes each other because they're all just getting their own way and they're all getting everything that they want all the time. And everyone is completely isolated and there are no relationships. Total autonomy, I'm telling you, it does not lead you where you think you want to go. When you say no to your Creator King, you are choosing a replacement. And I'm telling you, the replacement you choose will not have compassion. The replacement will not have mercy. The replacement will not have grace. The replacement kings are as unmerciful as they are unforgiving. Some of the examples of the little kings, the little kings we come up with. Appetite, I want what I want, when I want. You can't tell me what to do. I'm tired of being told what to do, and so I'm just gonna take whatever it is that I want. I'm tired of not prioritizing me in this. Or there's insecurity. Insecurity where, I'm tired of not fitting in. I want to be a Christian, but I get made fun of at family meals. People look at me and they act like I'm crazy around the lunch table at school or at work. I'm just kind of tired of being an alien and a stranger. I want to prioritize me for a moment. Fear, comparison, seeing what everybody else has and wanting it for ourselves. There's lust, that's kind of self-explanatory. Greed, consumption, family history. For some of you, your unwritten goal in life is to be nothing like your parents and to raise your kids in a way that's nothing like the way your parents raise you. And I get that. I understand that there may be this kind of history that you have, but I'm just telling you, if you choose another king instead of your Creator King, you will end up in the exact same place that your parents ended up. And the reason for that is they prioritized themselves. They said, what I want, when I want, with whom I want, and nobody's going to tell me what to do. And it's what led your family to the place where it currently is. And as long as you say no to your Creator King, I am telling you, you will not make a difference. Your generation, your family history will not change. But if there's a God who loves you and who cares so much about you, why wouldn't you want to say yes to him? Why wouldn't you want to surrender? What's funny about the little kings? The little kings always lead us to say, I won't. I won't. I won't do what you want me to do. I won't choose your morality. I won't say no to spending. I'm not going to live on a budget. That's stupid. I don't care what you think or what you say. I don't care about your moral purity. I'm autonomous. I do what I want. But you know the problem with saying I won't all the time? Is that at some point you wake up and you realize, now you're saying I can't. I can't stop this. I can't stop the spending. I can't stop looking at these things I know I shouldn't be looking at. I can't stop this relationship that I know is leading me down a bad path. I can't stop drinking. I want to have a clear conscience. I want to be able to unsee all the things that I've seen, but I can't give this up. So here's an interesting question, and I think it's an important question for all of us in our faith journey, and it may help explain God and may help you understand God a little bit better. The question is, why is it always easier to say no to God than it is to say no to the things you substitute for God? Have you ever thought about that? I mean, why is it always easier to sleep in on Sunday morning? Why is it so easy to wake up at 6 a.m. and do CrossFit, but it's impossible to be at church at 11? Why is it so easy to prioritize spending on a new car or new house or, Christmas gifts for whomever, but investing in God's kingdom? I mean, why is it so easy? I mean, there's this effortless, relentless pull toward I want. Why is it so easy? In the famous book, Crime and Punishment, it's a story about this man named Raskolnikov who commits this heinous crime, and he thinks in committing this murder that it's going to set him free. He thinks he can quit, whatever it is that he's going to be attracted to. But the book describes him as a lamb, like an animal going to the slaughter. And he had no ability to say no. Why is it so hard in the opposite direction? Why is it so much easier to say no to your Creator King than it is to say no to the created thing? I'm telling you, that's worth spending some time on. There's something spiritual going on. The Apostle Peter says the devil, our enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. He says you need to resist. Because the pull toward our substitute gods, the pull toward the little kings is so very strong. And they have no mercy. They do not give us life. They take our life from us. And you know what they do? They claim to set us free, but they leave us with shame and regret and embarrassment and secrets. At the end of this kind of period for the nation of Israel, not at the entire end of the book of Judges, but just kind of this beginning of the book of Judges, take a look at what the text says. The anger of the Lord burned against Israel, so that he sold them into the hands of Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Aram, to whom the Israelites were subject for 8 years. So what God essentially said to the Israelites is, you know what? You want their king, you can have their king. At least you can pronounce my name. Good luck. And for 8 years, they were subject to this other king, and they wanted God back. They wanted him back, but they didn't know how. Because they had said yes to these little kings so much. And you know what they did then? They did the very thing that I've done, that so many of us in the room have done, maybe the very thing you need to do. They cried out. They cried out to God for help. They said, we can't do this on our own. We've said yes to the little king so much, now we can't say no to them. Because they discovered that in our attempt to do what we want, when we want, with whom we want, we simply trade one king for another. And that's exactly what Israel did. And it was not the utopian paradise they thought it was going to be. But you know the good news? Because there is good news here. The good news is God said, I'll rescue you. The good news and the beauty of this story, please don't miss this. I mean, it's the beauty of the season that we are about to enter into, the Christmas season, where we celebrate God in his incredible mercy and grace, seeing our need and sending his son for us. I mean, that's what we get to celebrate at Christmas. That is the gift. But God never forces his way on us. Do you know why he lets us choose? Because love always lets people choose. It's not love if you don't get to choose. It can't be love if you don't get to choose. And so God says, I'm going to let you choose. In fact, God said, I think your autonomy is so important, I'm just going to give it to you from the beginning. Knowing that you're going to push me away, knowing that you're going to walk the other direction, knowing that at some point you're going to cry out to me. And so I'll go ahead and just give you your autonomy, but I'm going to prepare a way to restore you when you're ready to return. And the thing that we all begin to discover is that our maximum freedom is found when we submit our autonomy to God, our Heavenly Father's authority. That's where true freedom is. And your autonomy is so important to God that he chose to give it to you. You know, one of my favorite things as a pastor is I get to hear people's stories. You know, every once in a while, somebody wants to talk after the service, or they call me up and want a meeting, and they just share about what they've done in choosing a lesser king. And they share their story about all that they've went through and the joy that they bring. That's why we celebrate baptisms. That's why we have baptism videos. I have not yet met a person who walks up to me and says, I just can't wait to record a baptism video. Do you know why we make people record their baptism videos? Because we think it's so important for each one of us to hear stories, to be reminded of where we have personally come from, and to be inspired of where God may want to take you. That's why it's so important that we get to share in what God our Father is doing in each other's lives. I love hearing those stories. I love hearing the stories of people returning to their Creator King. But do you know what's painful when I hear those stories? What's painful is the scars that they bear. Because there's a season of their lives, whether it was their 20s or their teenage years or, their first marriage, second marriage, there's just this scar that people carry because every choice we make comes prepackaged with a consequence. And that consequence will either bless us or it will scar us. And as much as we are set free and God, erases our sin from our tablet or slate before him, it doesn't erase the consequence. And that's not God's punishment. That's just the reality of life. And there are scars. Man, when I was a youth pastor, I would talk to our students all the time about you don't know what this decision you're making today, how it will carry with you for the rest of your life. And yes, you are forgiven. Yes, you are forgiven. Yes, God has restored you. But there are things you carry that will be a permanent part of your story, which is why it's always so much better to make the decision early, to submit to your Creator King. And you know the great news? When you cry out to him and say, God, I'm tired of the little gods. I'm tired of the little gods controlling me, gods of pornography, gods of sexuality, gods of workaholism or appetite or self-image or trying to look like everyone else, or gods of my family history, or gods of generational dysfunction or bitterness. When you cry out to him and say, God, I am tired of these little kings controlling me. They're destroying me. What began as I won't has become I can't. The thing I want you to know is this, that your king is willing to rescue you. He is willing to rescue you. But he knows how powerful the little kings are, and he knows that anything less than full surrender will leave you in a place of pain that you are currently in. And so it is only full surrender that can bring about the healing that needs to take place in your life. Know this, choosing autonomy is not actually choosing freedom. You're simply trading one king for another. And that sets us up for next week as we continue on in our series, Right in the Eye. Let me pray for us. Heavenly Father, this is a challenging thing because so many of us, every one of us in our stories, we can think of times when we have refused to submit to you and instead we've opted for a lesser king, and it seemed so good, it promised so much, and it delivered so little and left us wanting. It left us hurt and in pain. It left us being unable to say no. And Father, instead of saying yes to these created things, we want to be able to say yes to our Creator King. And for the person who's just kind of struggling, I pray that you would give them the power and the strength to do that. Lord, help them not to carry any more scars than are necessary in the journey. Would you bring each one of us to a point of submission and surrender to you, not because you demand it, but because we want to choose it, knowing that it's the best thing for our lives. Father, thank you for this time. I ask that you would give each one of us wisdom to know what we need to do with what we've heard today, and then give us the courage to do it. I pray in Jesus' name, amen.